Russia's spring offensive is dying. Not at the negotiating table, not in some distant strategic retreat planned behind closed Kremlin doors, but right now on the front lines where Ukrainian drones are tearing apart battalion after battalion with a ferocity that Moscow never saw coming and still cannot explain to its own people. In March 2026, alone, over 35,000 Russian soldiers became casualties. That is a 29% spike from the month before, and 96% of those losses were inflicted by drones. Not artillery, not tanks, not airstrikes, drones. Small, cheap, relentless machines that are rewriting the rules of modern warfare in real time. And what makes this even more devastating for Moscow is that Russia's own defense minister has now told Putin directly and without ambiguity that the situation has reached what he called a critical threshold. When the man responsible for running your entire war machine sits across from you and admits that the enemy has developed weapons your forces have never seen before and cannot counter, you are no longer fighting a war on your terms. You are surviving one. Today we are going to break down exactly how Ukraine built this drone dominance from the ground up, why Russia's generals are now scrambling for answers they simply do not have, and what this shift means for the entire trajectory of a war that has already consumed more than 1.3 million Russian casualties over 4 brutal years. To understand the full scale of what is unfolding right now, you need to go back to the final days of 2025. Putin stood before the Russian people on New Year's Eve, projecting confidence, urging faith in ultimate victory, promising that 2026 would be the year of decisive progress on the battlefield. The spring offensive was supposed to deliver on that promise. Moscow had spent months rebuilding depleted units, cycling fresh conscripts through abbreviated training programs, and repositioning armor and artillery along key axes of advance. According to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, in their comprehensive assessment, published on April 3, 2026, Russia launched this offensive in early March with the explicit strategic goal of breaking through Ukrainian defensive lines before Western military aid could fully recalibrate the balance of power on the ground. The plan was straightforward in the way that Russian military planning has always been straightforward: mass momentum and attrition. Throw enough men and machines at the problem, and eventually something gives. But something had already changed. Something that the Kremlin either failed to detect during its planning phase, or worse, chose to ignore, because it did not fit the narrative that Putin's generals had been feeding him for months. Ukraine had been quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary discipline, building a drone army unlike anything the world has seen deployed in an active conventional war. According to the Atlantic Council, in a detailed analysis published in early April 2026, Ukraine's middle-range drone campaign had been escalating at a pace that should have set off alarm bells in every intelligence office in Moscow. These middle-range drones are not the short-range first-person view drones, or FPV drones, with a typical operating radius of about 20 kilometers that have dominated the close combat footage coming out of this war since 2023. Middle-range systems operate deeper, striking Russian logistics hubs, command posts, ammunition depots, and troop staging areas well behind the line of contact. In January 2026, Ukraine conducted 41 middle-range drone strike missions. In February, that number climbed to 61, and in March, it exploded to 115. That is nearly a threefold increase in just 2 months. Each of those missions represented a coordinated strike package, often involving multiple drones operating simultaneously against high-value targets that feed Russia's frontline operations. And here is where things get really serious for Moscow. On April 3rd, President Zelensky made a public announcement that carried enormous strategic weight. According to Ukrinform, Zelensky revealed that British intelligence, specifically MI6, one of the most respected signals and human intelligence agencies on the planet, had assessed that the current frontline situation represented the best position Ukraine had enjoyed in 10 months. 10 months. That takes you back to the summer of 2025, before Russia's autumn advances, before the winter grinding campaigns, before Moscow poured hundreds of thousands of additional troops into the meat grinder. Zelensky shared this assessment publicly and deliberately, a signal not just of quiet confidence, but of a calculated information campaign designed to show Western allies, Russian domestic audiences, and the world at large that Ukraine is not merely holding the line, it is winning. Reuters confirmed the same assessment through independent sourcing, noting that Zelensky described the battlefield posture as the strongest since mid-2025. We'll be explaining what that operational advantage looks like in practice soon. But first, the raw numbers tell a story that no amount of Russian state television propaganda can rewrite. On March 17, 2026, Russia lost 1,710 soldiers in a single 24-hour period. That was the highest single-day casualty figure recorded anywhere in this war during 2026. To put that in context, a standard Russian motorized rifle battalion fields roughly 600 to 800 personnel. Moscow lost the equivalent of more than 2 full battalions in one day. By March 25th, the situation had deteriorated further. Ukraine had eliminated a volume of Russian reinforcements equivalent to an entire week's worth of fresh conscript arrivals in just 3 days. Russia was losing soldiers faster than it could replace them, and the replacement pipeline itself was shrinking. The ISW's assessment from April 13th confirmed that Russian recruitment numbers have fallen significantly, even as frontline casualties have surged, a devastating combination that points to a structural manpower crisis that neither money coercion nor patriotic rhetoric can solve. And on April 11th, Russia lost another 1,440 troops in a single day, confirming that March 17th was not an anomaly. It was the new baseline. And this is where things start to shift in a way that the Kremlin cannot reverse. 1,001 Vodkwa, 1,000 Kitu. According to the ISW's April 10th assessment, Ukraine deployed a rapidly expanding fleet of purpose-built interceptor drones, designed specifically to hunt and destroy incoming Russian drones at a fraction of the cost of a traditional missile engagement. The numbers behind this program are nothing short of staggering. In January 2026, Ukrainian interceptor drones shot down 2,975 Russian drones. In February, that figure climbed to 3,679. And in March, Ukrainian interceptors destroyed 7,674 Russian drones. That is a 258% increase in just 3 months. Ukraine is not just defending against Russian aerial attacks anymore. It is systematically shredding them with technology that costs a tiny fraction of what Russia spends to launch each wave. Every Shahed that gets destroyed by a Ukrainian interceptor drone represents a net economic loss for Moscow and a net gain for Kiev. And the trajectory since then has only accelerated beyond what even optimistic analysts predicted. But before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you're watching Russia Crisis Report. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. So hit subscribe to ensure you stay ahead of the curve. The second pillar is the Deep Strike drone campaign. And this is where Ukraine's innovation starts to hit Russia, not just militarily, but economically. While interceptor drones defend Ukrainian skies, long-range strike drones with an operational reach exceeding 300 kilometers are carrying the war deep into Russian territory. And we are not talking about symbolic gestures aimed at Moscow apartment buildings for the evening news. These are precision strikes against strategic infrastructure targets that directly sustain Russia's ability to wage war and fund its military. At the end of March and into early April 2026, Ukraine launched a series of carefully coordinated attacks against two major Russian ports on the Baltic Sea. These ports are critical nodes in Russia's oil export network, the economic lifeline that funds the Kremlin's entire war effort. According to Fortune magazine, in a detailed analysis published on April 13th, the strikes were devastating. Both ports were forced to shut down entirely. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. With global oil prices already elevated due to market instability, triggered by Operation Epic Fury in Iran, Russia had been anticipating a windfall from increased revenue on its Baltic oil shipments. Instead, Ukraine's drones denied Moscow an estimated $1 billion in expected oil revenue in a matter of days. That is asymmetric warfare executed at the highest level of strategic sophistication. A fleet of drones, each costing a fraction of a single cruise missile, just erased $1 billion from the Russian war economy. And Ukraine is not stopping there. Simultaneously, Ukrainian forces have been systematically destroying Russian air defense systems along the flight corridors leading to these deep targets, creating what military analysts describe as aerial highways, cleared pathways free of enemy radar coverage, and missile engagement zones through which future drone strikes can penetrate even deeper into Russian territory with reduced risk of interception. What comes next could change everything about how Russia calculates the economic cost of continuing this war. The third pillar, and the one that has clearly alarmed the Kremlin more than anything else, is what Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belusov himself described to Putin as a new generation of devices that Russian forces have never encountered on the battlefield before. According to RBC Ukraine reporting on April 10th, Belusov delivered this warning to Putin in a direct face-to-face briefing. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not frame it as a temporary setback or a manageable challenge. He told the president of the Russian Federation that the drone situation had reached a critical threshold and that Ukraine was deploying technology that Russian forces could not identify, could not counter, and could not replicate. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a Ukrainian propaganda outlet making this claim. This is not a Western think tank speculating from satellite imagery. This is Russia's own Minister of Defense, the man Putin personally appointed, to replace the disgraced Sergei Shoigu, admitting to his commander-in-chief that the enemy has leaped ahead technologically in the domain that now matters most on this battlefield. The ISW's corresponding assessment, also published on April 10th, confirmed that Ukraine has achieved what analysts now formally call drone superiority on the battlefield. That term carries enormous weight in military discourse. It echoes the concept of air superiority, the condition in which one side can operate freely in the airspace while denying that same capability to the adversary. Ukraine has now achieved the unmanned equivalent of that condition, dominating the low-altitude, beyond visual range domain that has become the single most decisive factor in determining who lives and who dies on this battlefield. Now, that's not even the worst part for Moscow. Consider the operational reality of what drone superiority means in practice on the ground. In March 2026 alone, Ukrainian drones struck over 150,000 individual targets across the entire theater of operations. 150,000. That includes individual soldiers in fighting positions, armored vehicles moving toward the front, logistics convoys, hauling ammunition, and fuel command posts, attempting to coordinate offensive operations, and electronic warfare systems trying desperately to jam Ukrainian drone signals. The cumulative Russian casualties for March, as confirmed by Ukrainian General Staff reporting cross-referenced with ISW analysis, reached 35,351 personnel, with 96% attributed directly to drone strikes. Russia's spring offensive, the campaign Putin stood on national television and promised would deliver decisive results, has produced zero meaningful territorial gains on any front. The ISW confirmed on April 9th that Russian forces have failed to achieve a breakthrough on any axis of advance. And in several sectors along the Eastern Front, Ukraine has actually recaptured positions that had been lost months earlier during Russia's autumn and winter pushes. And then there is the Starlink factor, which has quietly compounded Russia's drone crisis in ways that are only now becoming fully visible to outside analysts and commentators. Ukrainian forces leveraged Starlink satellite internet connectivity to coordinate drone operations in real time across vast distances, enabling complex swarm tactics, rapid mid-mission retargeting, and a level of distributed battlefield awareness that Russian forces simply cannot replicate with their existing communications infrastructure. In Russian-occupied territories, where Starlink access has been effectively cut off and restricted, Russian drone operators are working with degraded communications, slower reaction times, fragmented situational awareness, and a fundamental inability to achieve the kind of networked real-time coordination that makes Ukraine's drone operations so devastatingly lethal. According to Newsweek reporting on April 14th, the technological gap has now extended well beyond drones into other unmanned systems. Ukrainian ground-based military robots forced Russian soldiers to surrender for the first time in the entire four-year war, a landmark moment that signals the accelerating future of autonomous and semi-autonomous combat platforms on the modern battlefield. This widening communication and technology disadvantage is accelerating Russian losses at a rate that Moscow's notoriously rigid top-down command structure is struggling to even comprehend, let alone develop meaningful countermeasures against. So what does all of this mean for the broader strategic trajectory of this war? Russia now faces a convergence of simultaneous crises that no single policy decision, no leadership reshuffle, and no amount of emergency defense spending can resolve quickly enough to alter the current battlefield dynamics before they become irreversible. Manpower is collapsing at a rate that threatens the fundamental sustainability of Russian offensive operations. The ISW's April 13th report noted that Russian recruitment has slowed dramatically across all categories, including contract soldiers and mobilized personnel, even as frontline losses have reached historically unprecedented levels. This is creating a growing deficit that has forced Moscow to increase conscription quotas and lower entry standards in ways that are deeply unpopular, domestically, politically toxic for the Kremlin's carefully managed public image, and militarily counterproductive as poorly trained replacements arrive at the front, only to become drone targets within days. The drone technology gap is not narrowing. It is widening with every passing week, and the acceleration curve favors Ukraine decisively. Ukraine's production capacity, bolstered by Western electronic components, allied technical expertise, and an increasingly sophisticated domestic defense industry that has proven remarkably adaptive and innovative under extreme wartime conditions, is scaling faster than Russia can develop test field and distribute effective countermeasures. By the time Moscow identifies a new Ukrainian drone variant, reverse engineers its capabilities, and develops a response, Ukraine has already moved on to the next generation. And economically, the Baltic port strikes have demonstrated something that should genuinely terrify every strategic planner sitting in the Russian Ministry of Defense. Ukraine can now credibly and repeatedly threaten Russia's oil export revenue, the single most important funding source for the entire Russian war effort and the broader Russian state budget, with precision drone attacks that cost almost nothing relative to the catastrophic economic damage they inflict. $1 billion in lost revenue from a handful of drone sorties involving machines that cost less than a used car. That is not a ratio that favors the defender in any scenario. Putin's silence in the face of all this is perhaps the most revealing signal of all. On April 7th, a full week after Zelensky's triumphant announcement of the MY6 assessment, and just days before Belusov's grim warning became public knowledge, the Kremlin offered no substantive response to Ukraine's demonstrated drone superiority. No announcement of a crash counter-drone development program. No dramatic reshuffling of field commanders to signal urgency. No fiery rhetoric on state television promising swift and devastating retaliation. Just silence. And in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of war, silence from the side that is losing is never a sign of strategic patience or calculated restraint. It is paralysis. Russia has now accumulated over 1.3 million total casualties since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. 4 years of relentless grinding war, and the Kremlin's only remaining answer to Ukraine's relentless innovation has been to throw more human bodies into a killing field that is now automated, networked, precise, and utterly without mercy. Belusov's warning to Putin was not merely a routine intelligence briefing or a request for additional resources. It was an admission delivered at the highest level of the Russian state by the man most responsible for the conduct of this war that the fundamental character of the conflict has changed irrevocably, and that Russia finds itself on the wrong side of that transformation, with no clear path to recovery and no obvious strategy to regain the initiative. The question now is not whether Ukraine can sustain this advantage through the summer and into the autumn. The production numbers suggest it can. The question is whether Russia can endure this punishment long enough to reach a negotiating table with anything meaningful left to bargain with. And based on everything we have seen unfold over the last 6 weeks, that is a question that even the men sitting inside the Kremlin do not appear to have an answer for. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to Russia Crisis Report to see more of our coverage of Ukraine's drone revolution and the shifting dynamics of this war. And thank you as always for watching.